They're looking for the right thing at the right time and in the desired way. That all of those things are entirely subjective, and we need to be thinking more fluidly around how to get to that using the thing that AI is good at, like understanding what someone wants and replicating that experience based on knowledge of that user.
We heard pretty specifically from physicians that they're all for using AI for clinical and professional purposes. They are more inclined to use it when it's something that is embedded into the way that they're just sort of naturally navigating.
Recent research reveals a 4-stage digital healthcare journey, a conditional and growing role for AI tools, as well as a meaningful generational divide in terms of how physicians approach new technology. So what does this data mean for pharma marketers and communicators trying to reach HCPs on their terms? Hello and welcome to the MM+M podcast. I'm Managing Editor Jack O'Brien. For today's conversation, we're talking with Assembled Intelligence and InVibe, who surveyed 150 US-based physicians across 12 specialties to understand how HCPs find, evaluate, and act on clinical information in an increasingly fragmented digital environment. I'm pleased to be joined by Chuck Heeman, Chief Business Officer at Assembled Intelligence, and Christopher Farina, Director of Listening and Linguistics at InVibe. Chuck and Christopher, welcome to the show. How are you both doing today?
Great, Jack. Thank you for having us.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you. Very, very excited to be here today.
I'm excited to have you on. It's an interesting project that you embarked on, and some of the findings I think are going to be useful for our audience, especially as they go about trying to understand this constantly evolving digital landscape that they're thrown into with patients, HCPs, and caregivers. But let's start with the big picture. There's this why now question. The HCP digital landscape has been studied for years. So what made this research feel urgent or different from what's already out in the marketplace?
Yeah, it's a good question, Jack, because as you and all of the listeners know, there is a significant volume of research about HCP attitudes toward particular channels or consumption behaviors for particular channels. I think there were a couple of reasons why we felt like now was a good time to do this work. The first is AI is changing literally every dynamic that we all as consumers and physicians have in their day-to-day practices with these channels. It introduces a new layer that a lot of the older channel consumption studies didn't really dig into. I think the other thing is a lot of those studies historically have focused on the quantitative responses from physicians. I think our survey with InVibe takes into account the quantitative, but also the qualitative feedback that we hear directly from physicians and how they're interacting with those tools and expressing the experience with those channels in their own words that, you know, something like a multiple choice or typical survey instrument wouldn't necessarily allow us to do.
So this is going to get into kind of the meat of how you actually went about doing this. And I'm curious just because I've never had to embark on doing like a full-fledged survey or something. Usually when we do things at MM+M, we have other companies or experts that we work with. So talk to me a little bit about combining a quantitative survey with unmoderated voice interviews and acoustic analysis. Like, how does that methodology matter? Where do you get that qualitative layer that the numbers alone can't tell you? Like, how do you actually do all of that and then get the results that you ended up with?
Yeah, I can take this one, Chuck. And this is very much my thing. This is my field. This is what I live for, right? I'm a social scientist. I'm a linguist. I'm trained as a mixed methods researcher. So why would you need all of these moving parts when you could just do a quantitative survey is what I went to school for and what I live every day for. And the way that I usually break it down is a quantitative survey is the thing that's going to give you that baseline. It's going to give you the valid, if it's designed well, generalizable findings that you can then take and say, let's do this, right? It's what folks in our biz believe to be the most actionable set of data. But what it doesn't necessarily say is what actions you should take if you guessed wrong the first time, or why you should be taking the ones that you're taking. And that's where that qualitative picture comes in, where you're getting the whys, you're getting the hows, you're getting the little bits and pieces that take the original stimuli, the original bits that you put in front of folks to react to, and make it the thing that they actually live and they feel connected to and they resonate with. Where we came in and where it's a little bit different from that traditional mixed methods approach is InVibe is a listening company. So we work exclusively with linguists on our research team. So that's all of our trade and training. And the linguistic and acoustic analyses take it a little bit further than your traditional qualitative reporting, which I like to think of qualitative reporting as like your book report. It's just what someone is saying. And a linguist adds another couple layers onto that of like how they're saying the thing. So are they saying it with a great deal of confidence in their voice, or emphatic language that indicates that they're really into this thing, either positively or negatively? And same thing with the acoustics, how it sounds, like what in their voice is changing. Like we'll talk a little bit later on, I bet, about the specifics around folks' perspectives on AI. And you can hear real shifts in people's tones of voice when they're talking about AI for purposes that they're comfortable with and purposes that they're not. And to be able to not just have that intuition, but to have measurements and data around those differences just really brings a full and complete picture to what I need to do and why.
I think what I'm, very focused on what the results are telling us. And I want to connect those results to what Christopher was talking about in terms of the methodology and give you an example. In the research, one of the things that we discovered was physicians are skeptical about social media. They're not necessarily inclined to use consumer social media platforms for clinical purposes. And I think a typical quantitative survey would have ended there. One of the things that we discovered through the acoustic analysis and the audio responses is that, in fact, physicians say that it's not, those consumer social media platforms are not particularly helpful for clinical purposes, but they do say they're helpful for their patients. They do also admit that they are exposed to product advertising from pharma on consumer social media platforms. They do say that, there is value in platforms like YouTube for professional learning. They do say there's value in podcasts for professional learning. So I think the quantitative analysis would end up stopping short of what the true picture actually looks like. And the true picture is, I think, far more complicated than just they don't use consumer social media for clinical purposes.
And I want to get into that is when we're actually talking about the findings and the results that you ended up with. The framework comes out of this data that organizes HCP behaviors into 4 stages. Search is the starting point, industry sources is the evidence base, AI is the efficiency layer, and then social and streaming as awareness. Did any of those surprise you, or how'd you evaluate that on the uptake?
Yes, there were several parts of this that were surprising. The first was simply the frequency and the value that physicians say they're getting from AI. Again, this is where I think nuance matters. It isn't AI for the sake of it. It's AI that is embedded into their sort of daily workflows. We heard pretty specifically from physicians that they're all for using AI for clinical and professional purposes. They are more inclined to use it when it's something that is embedded into the way that they're just sort of naturally navigating. I am sort of interested also in the fact that, search is not a new platform, but it is still the front door for many brands. Even with the advent of AI, even with the advent of social media, even with the advent of and more sophisticated targeting around connected TV, search is still the place that physicians frequently start the journey. Christopher and I have talked about this a lot. I'm of the mind that if we run this survey 6 months from now, that AI might overtake search as the front door to the brands, which we could talk about probably at length as we get into this podcast. But I think that's my hypothesis, that we'll see that sort of shift. But those are a couple things that caught my attention right away when we got the results.
Yeah, and I am sure, like I am willing to throw the crystal ball out there that if we redid this research in 6 months, the data would be demonstrably different. Like that's another great response to that why now question. Like with how rapidly this landscape is changing, why not now? Like why wouldn't you be doing this every 3 to 6 months to track how things are changing and to stay on top of them? But as for the specific question around, what is surprising? I think the things that hit me the most are subtle changes in what I'm used to hearing from physicians. Like I'm used to hearing that they're a little bit protective of certain media that they hold dear or specific use cases. And in this case, like the strength of their please do not fill my personal channels with things that I don't find valuable or with things that are too work related, was just a really strong message that I'm just not used to hearing with the force that it had in this time. So I think that may be something that shifts as folks are dealing with more and more information and they're looking for easier escapes, that their perceptions around what channels are acceptable and what kinds of content they want in each are going to start shifting along with it. I know we'll talk about this in a bit, but the second big one that hit me, and I think the one that I noticed first and I first made public, that the drop in AI usage as the stakes get higher. Like they love AI. They're using it all the time. They're using it as a search replacement or as other little fiddly, quote unquote, side tasks. But when the rubber hits the road and they need to make that important decision, they're still relying on the tried and true kinds of channels that they always have. And I would have to turn in my linguist card if I didn't also find something like interesting around how their language and their lexicon differs from how we talk in our business. Like when we ask the HCPs about industry sources, we're usually thinking about publications, clearinghouses, like, UpToDate, PubMed, New England Journal, those kinds of things. But they're coming out there with, human subject matter experts, KOLs, pharmaceutical reps, podcasts, YouTube. And they're still seeing these with the gravitas of industry sources because somewhere down their lines, they really are like distantly connected to an industry or to an authority. And to see again, like that's shifted a lot over the years as something like, oh, source of truth actually matters again, but not in the way that we think it did, is always interesting to uncover.
You teased that one out about the AI usage and trust, and I'm curious about that because what the study had ultimately found is that about half of physicians study the use of ChatGPT professionally, but their trust dropped significantly for new clinical data. And so I guess for our audience's sake what does that gap tell us about pharma content strategy and the needs going forward?
Yeah, I think at the most basic level, like we need to be thinking about content strategy that optimizes for LLMs, just like we've always done around search engines and SEO. The LLMs have to be able to take this information up. It has to be able to be shared through these services. It has to be citable accurately. So like practically speaking, that means we have to do a lot in Markdown. We have to do a lot in things that LLMs can quote unquote read. Our web-based information has to be clear, structured, those kinds of things. I think more interestingly though, like in a more complicated way than just the simple, we need to treat this like a different version of search. I think we also need to be rethinking how we approach content. Because in a lot of respects, the internet has just been how well digital content can replicate a color printed piece of paper and how long that paper can be or how wide or how many different pieces of paper you can staple onto it. But with AI and with how folks want to deal with these kinds of bits of content, like they really seem to be looking at it more as an integrated system, that they're looking for the right thing at the right time and in the desired way, that all of those things are entirely subjective. And we need to be thinking more fluidly around how to get to that using the thing that AI is good at, like understanding what someone wants and replicating that experience based on knowledge of that user. I think it's cumbersome and it's going to take a lot of work and certainly a lot of proofing on getting these systems to work reliably. because I think right now they kind of work more like Clippy, like Microsoft Clippy, not to name drop, than they do like the AI in a movie that I think most people have in their minds when they're thinking about how they want to engage with these. So I think, if we're thinking about the future, we should be really thinking about taking steps that continue to reduce already cumbersome workflows so that folks stay within what they're doing and we give them the information in a way that they actually want it. But Chuck, I'll turn it over to you since this is very much your area of expertise.
Yeah, I spend a lot of my days these days with our internal teams at Assembled Intelligence and our clients talking about the subject of AI. And I was struck by a few things in the research, just how many physicians are using ChatGPT as a baseline professional use tool. I mean, we're talking about 80%. Half of the physicians we spoke to are using it for clinical data retrieval and use. There's a sort of growing cohort of tools in the market that they're experimenting with, similar to all of us consumers like Gemini and Claude. Open evidence was growing in popularity based on the research that we did. I think that landscape is only going to get more complicated and at the same time only going to get more helpful. The LLMs are similar to the sort of explosion of MarTech 15 to 20 years ago in that they're really good at reading market signals and creating products and tweaks to the model that respond to those market signals. And so we see already a race from multiple LLMs, Claude, ChatGPT, Perplexity, Amazon, making a move toward supporting physicians with AI. The other thing that I have been talking about internally, Jack, because I think it's an amazing opportunity for pharma. We listened to a few physicians talk about the fact that they actively use AI to create patient education material. And they're doing so because they're feeling like they're not getting the right kind of content or the right level of content from pharmaceutical companies. And so they literally are firing up the ChatGPTs of the world, taking notes and using those notes in the sort of exam room conversation to create patient education material that's helpful for the people that they're seeing. To me, that's an amazing opportunity for pharma to step in and be thinking about their own patient education material and how effectively or not they are getting that in the hands of the physicians they're trying to serve, so that they can in turn serve the patients. And whether that content is created by AI or not, like it reads as an opportunity to me.
And I got to ask the question too, because it's been so interesting just hearing the takeaways that you have from the research that you conducted. But anecdotally speaking, I think there's always this perception of like, oh, well, older, less digitally savvy HCPs are going to be the ones that are the hardest ones to impress upon with AI and all the functions that it brings to the table. And that somehow I've also heard the same thing said about younger, like Gen Z and younger millennial HCPs, that they're somehow more inclined in that direction. I've also heard people talking anecdotally that like, oh no, there's this kind of resistance because they've been raised in the digital age and they don't want to have another tool that's in there that could potentially endanger their job. All that to be said, what did you see from looking at a generational perspective in the research that you put in? What sort of findings are in there that people in our audience can come away saying like, oh, this is how we should kind of augment our strategy accordingly?
I think I'm gonna put my social scientist hat on, and I'm gonna reframe this and say that people tend to overcomplicate these kinds of things, and researchers and scientists in general are rewarded for finding and exaggerating small differences and ignoring the large similarities. And I think at this point in the usage of AI and based on the data, like we picked up all of the physicians who use AI using them in really naive ways. We're seeing them as search engine replacements. So people saying like key findings from conference, and that's what they're putting into their LLM, or treating them like a chat bot. Is there any trial going on for X disease? they're not doing the kinds of things that someone more familiar, someone more experienced with these tools is going to be doing. And that says to me, as the researcher on the other side, that folks aren't really encountering different problems yet. Like if you're a quote unquote digital native or not, we're not necessarily seeing those differences emerge here like we saw in engagement with social media right after Facebook opened up from folks who were not just currently attending universities. Like we're really still at the stage, I think, where we're focusing on the problems that everyone has. And we're trying to build on the use cases where AI or LLMs are solving the problems that people currently see as problems that the LLMs are able to deal with. Like, I think we're about to be in the stage where we're pushing folks toward new use cases that we're out there proposing and supporting folks as they start to learn what's going on and how these systems should work. But for the time being, I'm just not seeing a lot of evidence that says we need to treat any individual group differently or like overcomplicating our strategies based on age, when a single well-crafted approach that makes sure that these things are able to be engaged with intuitively and they're credible. You know, the data is very closely sorted and folks are dealing with some of the initial concerns around LLMs. Like until we get all that sorted out, like I would be really hesitant to put a finer point on it than that.
I wrote about this yesterday, Jack, on LinkedIn, because I've also been struck by this because I grew up in the agency business before social exploded, but certainly when social exploded. And the dialogue back then was similar. It was younger people are more inclined, older people are not. If you'll remember, even there was a time and place when there was a belief that only young people could execute social media programs on behalf of companies because they knew social media and they grew up in that age. We look back on that in a little bit of like that is completely preposterous. I think the same thing is true here. Physicians that are older, let's just say more than 10 years in their practice, are also using digital tools. They just happen to have a more defined base of tools that they will consistently leverage during their day-to-day practice. The younger physician is also a digital native, but is probably more likely to experiment with new technologies. And by the way, I think that's okay. Like, I don't imagine there being a world where everybody is standardized on one set of tools. I think these AI platforms in particular are so customizable based on your particular role in a particular company, or in this case, physicians and their particular specialty or years in practice, that there's no reason to say you must use something in place of something else. Will we get to a place where tools are consolidated and physicians are on a sort of common stack? I'm dubious of that, because if the MarTech boom, again, I hate to keep going back to that time period. If that MarTech boom is any indication, what's going to continue to happen is the platforms will listen to market signals. They'll create unique offerings, and people will gravitate toward those unique offerings because, to be completely frank, there is no incentive for the tech platforms to actually consolidate. No monetary incentive, anyway, for them to integrate.
And that's ultimately going to be the main driver, as we've seen the case for the past 10 to 15 years. But that's a separate conversation. Want to get to the end of the playbook that you guys put out there, where it talks about making this point of argument to track evidence engagement, not clicks. Obviously not the easiest to sell, I would say, to the audience that you're appealing to. Talk a little bit about why that case for a marketing leader should be more focused on the evidence engagement rather than the click-through rates.
Jack, in my prior life, it was an analytics leader for a very long time, and I focused a lot on measuring campaign success. And one of the things I always used to say to clients and during my time in-house is I was always wondering why we spent a year getting ready to launch a product and 2 weeks getting ready to measure the success of said campaign that we're betting the farm on the success of the company for. And I think with the advent of the sort of AI layer and the increasing kind of channel fragmentation that we're all dealing with, it is more important than ever to be thinking thoughtfully about the way that campaigns are measured. And I think that looks a little bit like some traditional engagement metrics, which are also evolving, right? It looks like attitudinal based metrics. It looks like the sort of bottom line NRX and TRX. But to track those sort of three layers of evaluation, you can't do that 2 weeks before the campaign is going to launch. It takes several weeks, if not months, in order to get there. And so one of the things we wanted to make sure we hammered home as part of that playbook is we're trying to give the readers a sense of how to leverage each channel and for what purpose, but don't over-index there to the detriment of being able to evaluate whether or not you were successful in implementing the first few phases of the playbook that we shared.
I couldn't agree more. And I think just the point boils down to we spend months and months on single sentences getting messages right, getting the concepts to reflect the reality that we want physicians to see in the world or patients to see in the world of like, yes, that is how I feel. That is what I want this product to do for me, or that is what I want this service for. And we really think carefully about every aspect of that message. We have, well-calibrated reasons to believe laid out. We have the full justification of how that's supposed to work. And then at the end of the day, we track it with, did anyone click the link and go to the website? It's just the singular, did you follow the most basic call to action? And I can't think about any other areas in our lives where that's where it ends for us. Like that's always a starting point. And the fact that in the digital landscape for so long, that's been where it ends just seems crazy to me because it's just missing so much. Like even among leading indicators, it's just missing so much.
I've really appreciated having this conversation because I don't think we've ever had a linguist on the podcast. So that's a first for us. But if there's one thing that a pharma marketer can walk away from this research and change one thing at their team and actually execute on, what would that be?
Can I cheat and offer two?
Sure.
The first one would be we have to be thinking a lot more dynamically about the plans that we build and execute because the landscape, primarily driven by AI, but it doesn't have to be only about AI, is changing quickly. 2 months ago, Claude Cowork, Claude Code, integrations between Claude and Excel and PowerPoint were nascent capabilities at best. 2 months from now, who knows what the LLMs actually look like and what they're capable of doing on behalf of pharma. And those changes have a lot of impact on the other channels they're executing. So I think the plans have to be a little bit more dynamic. The second thing I would say is I had an old boss who used to say that we are only snowflakes to our parents. And I think people view themselves as unique, and physicians would probably view themselves as unique. But I think Christopher said something a few minutes ago that is really insightful, which is there are some nuances between physician audiences, particularly as it relates to digital adoption, but not as many as we think. And I think oftentimes we go down the road of trying to be overly prescriptive, overly targeted, and probably are fragmenting our marketing dollars more than we should.
I always appreciate a good callback to myself, so I could not agree more with you on that. I do have one. I'm not cheating like Chuck is. So just one from me. And I know, if you look back in MM+M's old catalog of articles and such, you'll find listen to consumers, do not listen to consumers. These companies who do great don't. These companies who do great do. And the advice is just a really mixed bag. But I think from my perspective, I really want to emphasize the importance of listening to all of your stakeholder groups. So HCPs, patients, caregivers, payers, healthcare networks, like anyone that you're engaging with, sites and clinical trials. they all have important things to give to you. Like they have things that they know that you don't. They have perspectives that you need to understand, problems that you're trying to solve, like new ways of framing things that you haven't thought about. And they also, aren't us. Like they aren't necessarily able to articulate all of the different problems that we see going on. And I think only by listening to all of these folks, listening to the full spectrum of them, doing iterative work where you're hearing how things change over time, are you as a group able to put together an effective plan? And, we've heard a lot that it doesn't matter how good your execution is if your plan is poorly constructed. And I think this is just an opportunity here to remind folks that our plans are the thing that gets put out in the world. And if our plan isn't fully thought out, doesn't represent the world that it's going out into, a flawless execution is still a flawed result. And I know that we can do a lot better than that.
Well, Chuck and Christopher, really appreciate not only the research, but the conversation to highlight these insights for our listeners. Appreciate the time. I encourage everybody to go and check that out. And next time that we have an opportunity to speak with a linguist, I'm going to look forward to it because I've learned so much just in the course of this conversation. So thank you both for coming on here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you, Chuck.